I'm Michael Smerconish in Philadelphia, and I'm worried about COVID kids. That's my label for those coming of age in the midst of a pandemic. They're bearing the brunt of COVID, even though most infected children are at much less risk of becoming severely ill. It's a tough time to be young and on the verge of a personal and professional launch. Rises in depression, anxiety, and suicide attempts, all facing today's youth, accelerated by the impact of remote learning. Kids are back in school in New York City and in D.C., where students were required to produce a negative test result. But this week in Chicago, the third largest school district in the country, the teachers union voted to refuse to show up for in-person work, upending school altogether and these kids' lives. Tuesday, the second day back from winter break, Chicago Public Schools reported 422 new cases among students. While that's reportedly the highest in the school year, the district has more than 340,000 students. This translates to roughly 0.1% of the student body. That shouldn't bring everything to a halt. Thousands of other schools around the country have delayed a return to in-person learning. Cities including Atlanta, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Detroit have switched to online learning or postponed reopening. What happened to the funding that was supposed to alleviate all this? $130 billion of coronavirus relief funds were earmarked for ventilation in schools and social distancing in classrooms. And $10 billion more was set aside for testing in schools. So what have we done to our kids? As this New York Times headline puts it, no way to grow up. For the past 2 years, Americans have accepted more harm to children in exchange for less harm to adults. Included in statistics cited by its author, David Leonhardt, among 3rd through 8th graders, math and reading levels were all lower than normal this fall, according to NWEA, a research group. The shortfalls were largest for Black and Hispanic students, as well as students in schools with high poverty rates. On top of that, the non-academic aspects of school, lunch period, extracurriculars, sports, assemblies, plays, trips, they've all been curtailed or eliminated. I'm worried about kids being educated remotely and losing out on a whole host of social dynamics. What you can't get in the remote world are the life lessons, the human interaction, the forging of relationships. And then there are the slightly older members of what Dr. Jean Twenge calls iGen, the ones who graduated from high school or college without the pomp and circumstance of a traditional commencement ceremony, the ones that have missed out on social interactions that I mentioned and benefited from, riding the yellow school bus, jockeying for certain lunch tables in the cafeteria, playing after-school sports. Many are now beginning their first jobs, but without the close contact and mentorship of a colleague or on-site supervision of a boss. They too are missing out, losing the nuance that no Zoom or email or text can provide. Having participated in countless online meetings in the past 2 years, I know I'm a different person when things are being recorded. More stilted, less natural, and yes, sometimes that's a good thing, but it's not a fair reflection of a real back and forth. They're deprived of on-the-job collaborative efforts, not to mention the camaraderie of social time with coworkers. When I first began practicing law, I learned more from watching colleagues try cases than I did from sitting in lecture halls for 3 years in law school. Work habits are not being fully formed remotely. Somebody needs to tell today's new hires what it means to be on the clock, that bro and dude are inappropriate ways to communicate with a superior. And sometimes you just have to say yes, suck it up, and get the job done. These elementary students in Chicago who missed this past week of school, the high school and college students who have missed social and sports and academic milestones, and the new hires who are not picking up normal work practices while remote in their living rooms. They are all COVID kids, and they are not all right. And any time that society is contemplating a response to COVID, their needs need to be prioritized. Joining me now is Keri Rodrigues, co-founder and president of the National Parents Union. Keri, nice to see you here. So you're a former union organizer who then became a parenting activist. You have a presence in all 50 states. React to what I just said.
Well, I think you said it beautifully, Michael. And frankly, unfortunately, what we're looking at right now is no end in sight, because we have been in chaos for the past 20 months. And I was actually looking back on our notes last night. It was back in December of 2020, and where we were talking to the Biden transition team, asking, calling, crying for help, saying we need contingency plans. Our kids are not all right, and 86% of American families have told us in our national polling that mental health concerns and the crises we see unfolding in our living rooms, that's number one to us. And I don't know how much longer this can continue.
With regard to schools reopening, and obviously with Chicago top of mind, the red states, the blue states, they seem to have different responses, and I would argue neither of them is getting it just right. What do you see?
Well, the problem is a lack of leadership coming from the federal government. Again, as you mentioned beautifully, $130 billion, has been sent down to the states to literally deal with this situation. COVID-19 mitigation strategies, making sure that we had testing, making sure that we had the technology needed so if the worst case scenario happened, we'd be ready and prepared. But one of the most important lessons that we have learned over the last 20 months is that we must keep our schools open. They are essential. They are not nice to have. They are must-haves. And as you said before, we're going to lose an entire generation of kids if we do not hold this line.
It may be a gross simplification, but from my standpoint, I look at red states that open without regard for testing. I look at blue states that shut down without regard for mental health, and somewhere in between, as is usually the case, at least the way that I look at the world, is the truth and the way that they ought to be approaching it.
Well, the problem is, Michael, we're just being told to figure it out. And we're asking educators who are not epidemiologists to make these calls. They're not qualified to do so. So you're right. In red states, you have folks just saying, well, go back into the classroom. We'll figure this out if people get COVID. That's not safe. That's not going to keep classrooms open because you're going to see catastrophic numbers and you're going to have to shut classrooms down when half of the kids have COVID. It doesn't make sense not to have a test the Monday morning when you come back from a winter break to make sure you know who has COVID and who doesn't. I mean, that's just common sense. But then in the blue states, you've got a problem where it doesn't make sense that we're going to shut down all schools for 2 or 3 weeks, again, as if you had no idea that we were having winter break. Every kid in America should have been going home the Friday of winter break with a COVID rapid test, a couple of them, so that we knew when we were going back to school on Monday morning, you take your test, you're negative, you're good to go on the school bus. That's just common sense. It's as if we had no idea that winter break was going to happen and that we were going to have a COVID surge. You know, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm a mom of 5 little boys, and I had a pretty good idea that we were going to have a COVID surge, whether or not we got a variant or not, because we've learned some lessons about how this pandemic works.
Mine are older than yours. We have 4, 3 of them are boys. Our daughter is launched, married, and a mom of her own. But from my perspective, what concerns me are not only those still in school, but those who are on the verge of or should have launched by now. And they too are getting screwed in this process because in the last 2 years, they haven't been given the benefit of those things that I articulated at the outset. You get the final word. Go ahead.
Well, I got to tell you, Michael, last night I was talking to a family in North Philadelphia. And we've got a father with a master's degree, you've got a mom who is educated, has COVID, cannot work right now. He's trying to drive Uber. They have kindergarten kids, they've got college kids, whole giant family. And the dad just said, something's got to give. I don't have enough left in me to search for logins to try to get these kindergartners on Wi-Fi. I have a daughter who's really struggling because she's socially isolated. Like, when is this going to give? We're expected to hold up the American economy, still show up to work, still make sure we show up to run our hospitals. At the same time, we've got decisions being made in the American education system in a vacuum saying, well, just take 2 days off. That's not how the American society works. That's not how our families work. And we need to be seen because our families are in crisis right now. Our children are in crisis. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to me like we're using even the resources we have, $130 billion in funding, wisely to make sure that we're navigating this situation so that we're going to be okay at the end of this pandemic. We've got to start listening.
Keri Rodrigues, thank you so much. I really appreciate your having been here.
Thank you.